go. Oh, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. This is our first event with Joshua Hood. We're excited to see him.
Thank you very much for having me.
And we're back in. You got that up?
I'm not sure.
No.
I'm just a redneck. I don't know how to use this
Here.
technology stuff.
Just don't put your hands over the spur. You'll
So you just
turn
talk
it
in
off.
here?
Yeah, like that, like an ice cream cone.
Got
It's
it.
just a more polite way of positioning it. Right. Anyway, we've had a number of military fiction authors come our way recently, some of whom have actually served in the military, like Brad Taylor, Jack Carr, and some haven't. So tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your background for doing this?
My name's Josh Hood, and I graduated from college in 2003. Enlisted in the military. Right after that, went to the 82nd Airborne, spent to Iraq, and went to Afghanistan, got out, and it was kind of difficult to find a job at the time, so I went into the sheriff's department and was in patrol for about 18 months, and then had an opportunity to go to the SWAT team there and spent 8 years over there. Finally left as a sniper team leader, and while I was in SWAT, I started writing, and that kind of brings us to now.
It does, indeed. That accent, very southern.
I feel like there's some running jokes because I didn't know I had an accent until an interview for the Cruise Review went on Twitter, and I feel like now everybody is maybe a fan of the Cruise Review because everybody say, "Where are you from? You got a twang," and I've never noticed it until I came to Arizona and people told me that I talk funny.
So where are you from? You didn't answer the question.
I'm from Tennessee.
Okay, whereabouts?
In Memphis, but Mark doesn't talk this way, and we live very close to each other.
Very true. I lived in the other end of Tennessee for a long time in Oak Ridge and Knoxville, and your accent is different. But we always think of West Tennessee as really southern, and Mississippi and East Tennessee is Appalachian, and sounds quite different, more like North Carolina.
It does. It has kind of the remnants of the Scotch, and
Right.
it's a very
It's mountain and not river delta or river plain like the Mississippi around Memphis.
we just talk real slow.
Well, that's probably a good thing. Everybody will be able to understand you. I thought your background was really interesting in terms of, it's a real question because we talked to Mark Rainey about it, and he's never served in the military, and yet his books convey the sense that he has done that. He does a tremendous amount of research. He talks to lots of professionals. Jack has endless pages of acknowledgments for all the people that have helped him. CJ Box, who's coming next Monday, does have shooting experience, but his book called Long Range is really about a incredibly long range sniper shot. So he too has, really done some research and asked people for help about how to go about that. So I didn't know for sure what you brought to the table here for this Ludlum universe, but it sounds like you already know a lot of the stuff you needed.
Well, being besides being in the military, I was talking to a guy that was a police officer in Detroit, I think, the other day, and you don't really realize it at the time, but I worked a little undercover, narcotics and things like that. And what your job as a police officer undercover is very similar to, the tradecraft that a spy uses. You just don't realize it until you leave. And so when I was doing the research for Treadstone, from the military, my time in Iraq, time in Afghanistan, I had a front row view of the kinetic operations.
Mm-hmm.
But the higher level intelligent part, I guess is the word, I learned more of that from being on the SWAT team, working with, in Memphis we were a tier 1 SWAT team, which means we had to be certified in chemical, biological, hazards like that. And so we worked a lot with the FBI, the DEA, and so you learn all these things, and I think that is one of the things that makes people like Mark such a great writer, is because he's able to take the information that's out there and plug it in a way that someone who knows the rules wouldn't really be able to, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. I think that's a very good point. You know, when we talk about historical fiction, we often say that your job is to be convincing just as much as it is, or even possibly more so than to be accurate, although if you make some ghastly goof like giving somebody an aspirin in 1815, you know, it doesn't work out. But I think to some degree that's true with military fiction, but I also think that guys with guns are much more unforgiving of weaponry mistakes.
I heard a story once, and I don't know if it's 100% true, but I've heard it from multiple people. But Brad Taylor is not only the epitome of, you know, military thrillers, but he's got the background to back it
Right.
up.
Yeah, he was an Army Ranger. Right.
And the story goes that he put out a book, and you know the rifle ammunition that the M4 M16 shoots is a 5.56 or a 223, but the military version is 5.56. Somewhere in the copying edit, they left out the decimal, and the book came out. And there's these people on Amazon or wherever, like, you have no idea what you're doing. You know, you're such a hack. Obviously, they didn't like read his biography or know who this guy was, simply because, you know, a decimal was missing. And for me and some of the other military guys, like, I personally have to be cognizant of the fact that you had Tom Clancy and people like that who kind of invented the more technological thrillers. They were very, very heavy in these subjects, like, you know, how the bolts that go into a fan belt of a, you know, an engine, and you're just reading through, you're like, I don't want to build it, I just want to know what happens next. And then you have
then you have the guys that say if you didn't get the bolt right, you know, it's not worth reading. It's a tough line, you know, it's a tough audience. And I also think, you know, it's a hard line to walk, because what you're doing is you're trying to tell a great story, but you really do have to get an awful lot of technical stuff right if you're going to venture into that. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, because I thought it was fascinating, Venezuela. Wow. Everybody's tired of the Middle East? Tired of Asia?
Well,
You're just interested in Venezuela?
Well, of all the questions, you know, you kind of do like a radio tour and
Right.
stuff before everything. Everybody has asked me why Venezuela, and
It's different.
well, my thought was like I had written pretty much every book in the Middle East, and kind of tired of it.
Sorry, you'd written it or you'd read it?
Well, I'd read it, and
Okay.
I've been there too, so I'm just
Right.
like I have enough of the Middle East, and so I kind of felt that, especially for this book, I wanted to do something a little different, and so I looked into Europe. Well, that was kind of Bourne stomping ground, so that was off. And a lot of people were looking in, you know, Russia, China, and so I was like, I don't want to do that. I wanted a specific place that was wild, that was kind of, you know, anything could happen. But at the same time, I was thinking to myself, the book, Adam Hayes, is also a different type of protagonist, and I wanted a place that reflected what the inner conflict that he had, because I felt that, you know, the book is about him trying to find himself. If you boil it down, who is he after he leaves this? And I thought that Venezuela kind of checked all those boxes. Nobody was writing about it. There was so much going on there that, I mean, you didn't really have to make up a plot. You're like, just put in Venezuela, everything's going wrong there. and then it's, at the same time, I feel that, you know, the people, and, you know, I talked to a lot of people who had recently come to the United States from Venezuela, and, you know, they all love their country, and they all want, you know, something better for their country. And I thought that they kind of mirrored what I wanted to put into Adam Hayes.
Well, I think it's good to give them a voice. Part of the reason I asked you that is I don't know if any of you watched Jack Ryan season 2 on television, but it's all Venezuela all the time. And I watched it just before I read your book, and I thought how interesting, you know, that we suddenly have Venezuela coming up as a background for, the TV series, and now in your book, I think makes perfectly good sense. And speaking about Brad's last book, Under Killer, which he was just here Friday night, so I'm sorry you missed him again. You didn't miss him again. He was here again. Sorry, Friday night. Is Brazil. I mean, a huge amount of it, takes place in Brazil. So I'm thinking that for all the reasons you were just saying, maybe South America is going to be a bit of a shift for thriller writers because there's a lot going on.
Well, there is. What's so fascinating and dangerous about that area is it's so close to the United States. And, for me, I try to think of when I'm writing a book, like, what's the scariest thing in the world? Like, if I want to write a book, what is something that'll scare everybody? So I just ask my wife, hey, would this be scary? And most of the times when I'm talking about, like, geopolitical things in the Mideast, or especially, like, weapons, like, her eyes kind of glaze over, and, I'm like, hey, I asked you a question. I don't snap at my wife. She's watching this right now. I didn't snap at you, but I asked quite politely, hey, I'm asking you a question. And she's like, that doesn't interest me. But you start talking about something closer to home, especially, something not very far off our coast, but it's not in the news. And so when you start telling people, hey, do you know this is happening over there? Did you know Iran's moving drugs and people through Mexico? And she's like, that's not true. And then she actually read a book not too long ago, is a nonfiction piece about immigrants that are coming across. It was written a while back, the desert here, not far from here, and most people in the South don't hear about that. So suddenly she's like, well, if that's possible, you could bring whatever you wanted to across there, and suddenly it's a very interesting book as opposed to, oh, you're in the Middle East again, I've never heard of them.
Well, there's a lot. I've made, I'm trying to remember, was it 4 trips to Peru. And on my last trip, which I truly loved, my daughter and I were smuggled into Bolivia for the simple reason that we only had a day to go. And it turned out the night before, I probably shouldn't say this, but turned out the night before we were to meet the guide and go across into Bolivia, which my daughter really wanted to do, we discovered that it was $300 a person for a visa to go into Bolivia. And I said to Susan, there's a lot I would do, but I don't really think $600 for 12 hours in Bolivia is a really good idea. And she was disappointed, so but she agreed. So I called and said, we were going to cancel for the day, and they asked why, and I said I just thought it was an unreasonable expense to go to. So the next morning we went down to breakfast, and there they were in the lobby, and they said, we have a way. So anyway, they literally smuggled us into Bolivia. It was so funny. They wrapped us up with stuff, and we snuck around the whole bit, and which I decided later was probably standard operating procedure at the border crossing there below Lake Titicaca, because I imagine lots of people thought that it was a lot to spend for 12 hours in Bolivia. But it's a beautiful, historic, lots of history, incredible amount of natural resources, amazingly mixed populations. Brazil is just like loaded with people from all huge Japanese colony, German, Portuguese, Spanish, you name it. And I think myself that it's a theater just kind of waiting for, people to write about it, but it hasn't had the punch that the Middle East or Asia or Europe has had. But now maybe it will. So I was really pleased that you decided to go with Venezuela. Could I also, if I'm remembering it right, what are the colors of the Venezuelan flag? Aren't they kind of a little bit like this? Does anybody remember? No?
Google.
Yeah.
Why don't we look, if somebody could look it up, right, and tell me, because I was trying to remember the flag from the Jack Ryan thing, but it seemed to be
There was another book that came out recently. I think it was it Nelson DeVille and his son wrote The Deserter?
Yeah.
And I during the winter hunting season, I'll listen to books on tape when I
Right.
drive out to hunt. And I picked, Venezuela. I didn't think anybody else was going to be anywhere near Venezuela. I thought I was safe, so I get this book. It's a great book, The Deserter, and then it's like chapter 1, Venezuela. I'm like, oh my god, are you serious?
You guys are just pioneers in new geology. Did we find out what color it is? We're looking it up.
Yellow, blue, and red.
Okay, so yellow and red anyway, but the green is blue. But I was trying to figure out whether they had in fact keyed the jacket in part to the Venezuelan flag. So they got the yellow and red.
Hmm.
It's a very colorful jacket. I like it.
It's a beautiful picture, and how it feels, like the way it
Yeah, with
shifts
the
from the
embossing on
gloss.
it and all
It's
of that.
just amazing what they did with this cover. I mean, it's just so stunning.
So what brought you into the Robert Ludlum universe? Do you all know how this works? That authors who have had successful franchises can, through their literary estate and their literary executor, make a decision to have people continue to write the books, or make a decision not to let them write the books. So Sue Grafton, for example, specifically, her decision was nobody could go on and write Kinsey. Robert Parker, as you know, has 4 authors writing different franchises. Tom Clancy worked with Mark on 3 books before Tom died. And Robert Ludlum has had at least, 1 or 2 besides you, maybe more. So his estate, obviously, set it up because it provides satisfaction for readers who are sad to see, characters that they love in. It also is income for their families, for their heirs, because the books go on earning money. So that's how it works. And so, how did you sign on for Ludlum? Or maybe I should say, why did you sign on for Ludlum?
Well, the why is that kind of goes for itself. If someone says, would you like to write a Robert Ludlum? I'd grown up a huge fan of Ludlum, and I'd read Bourne before I saw the movie, and I was fascinated by, people ask, why do you think it's such a timeless story? And there's a lot of reasons, but, you boil it down to, there's a spy who can't remember he's a spy. Like, that's brilliant. And I remember just, we all kind of, maybe it's just me, but as a child I would think, like, what happens if he had superpowers or something? And that's what the movie was when I was reading it. He just, like, all of a sudden he speaks French, and all of a sudden he does this. And so it was a fascinating story that, it just continues to hold people's attention. And so what happened was I went down to BoucherCon with Mark Rainey, and I had met Tom Colgan, who's kind of like the master of these estate books. And somehow I guess I made a good impression. We didn't talk about Treadstone or anything like that. He'd read some of my books. I met him before. We just had a good time. And then about a week later, I get a call from Tom. He's like, hey, what are you doing? I said, nothing. Why are you calling me? This is awesome. And, usually when someone like that calls you, you think you're in trouble. And I was like, I don't think I owe him any money. And I don't think,
Did I misbehave at BoucherCon?
Yeah,
I just can't remember.
I was like, Mark, what'd I do? And he said, no, I would, the Ludlums they're continuing on with the Bourne series, but there's a show that came out on USAA, and I think it's called Treadstone, and they want a book. Would you be interested? And I was like, are they gonna pay me? And he's like, yeah. So basically he said, nothing on it, this doesn't really exist, so what do you want to write about? And I'm like, well, like right now? He's like, yeah, what do you want to... So we kind of like pitched this idea, and he's like, okay, now write it up. Give me a little synopsis, and then I think it was 3 chapters I had to write. And so I worked really hard on it, and it was one of those things where, like, right from the beginning, it's kind of embarrassing, but like suddenly things like start to go wrong. And so I sent it to Mark, and it's like, hey man, will you read this and just tell me if it's any good? And he's like, yeah, sure. So he's reading it, and he's like, man, that is really brave what you did. And I was like, what did I do? And he's like, how you just like switched from, third person past to present halfway through the book. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And he's like, did you read it? And I was like, yeah, I read it. And I guess I was tired and I just kind of pushed myself, but I went back and read it. And halfway through it just switches into, I mean, and I'm looking at it sitting here like, man, this is not good. Like, I should probably know the difference between past tense and present tense. If I'm going to send this to LUDLUM'S, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to get this job. So luckily, that's a true story. And luckily, I sent it to him and totally didn't notice. I have a lot of funny stories in the writing community. There are a lot of punchlines and then Josh did this. That's one of them. And fixed that.
Which way did you go?
I stayed in the past because it's pretty much, I think, acceptable. Like,
I think it would be harder to write a spy story in first person present for a whole lot of reasons, but you could do it.
Well, I mean, I tried.
Maybe Mark was thinking it wasn't as successful as it could have been, or he would have pointed it out.
A nice way of saying, like, what are you doing? You're about to mess this up, and this is terrible. But I fixed it, and they enjoyed it. And then originally, it was supposed to be, because my thought was more people had probably seen the movies and had read the original books. So I was kind of picturing where the movies had left off.
Mm-hmm.
And Treadstone, there was no Treadstone at the end of the movie. So that was kind of my plot. It was like, hey, Treadstone's over. And I just had my son, who's going to be 3 in March. And so I was sitting there thinking, like, I left the police department and the SWAT team when he was born. And I was like, what would happen to a guy on Treadstone who's been there for, like, let's just say logically 20 years, and it just closes, and like you go to work and it's not there anymore.
Right.
Like, I'm pretty sure they don't have 401k plans or insurance. I mean, you can't put, like, if you're going to get a job at Lowe's or something, you can't put I used to kill people for the United States government for 20 years. It just was like, it was kind of like this. It just stuck in my head. Like, what would a guy like that do? Yeah. And the other problem was Jason Bourne and Adam Hayes. Like, an assassin is kind of by nature a bad person, I guess. We'd all agree that even killing people for a living is not socially acceptable. That's what I thought. And but Jason Bourne, he can't remember, and so that's why we like him. But Adam Hayes, the guy that left after Treadstone closed, he would be able to remember. So how do you make him, a character that people would like to read about? And so that's kind of where I got into pitching the idea to them and trying to, the Venezuela thing, the idea of using Adam Hayes as a different type of Bourne, where you're dealing with a guy that can't forget versus can't remember. That's kind of my secret sauce, I think, maybe got me in there.
I like the title. I mean, I think the Treadstone Resurrection pretty much sets it up, that this is something that was defunct and people were left, as you say, out in the cold, and then what to do about it. So, is the trial run for Adam to come back and see if it works, all right? And then you have to decide at the end, no spoilers, whether it will continue to work or whether it was a one-shot, resurrection.
Right, and it was just a wonderful opportunity that I enjoyed, the entire time. It just kind of felt like Robert Ludlum was letting me borrow his really nice car, and I didn't want to mess it up.
So, where is Adam when we start the book? Where is he living and what's he doing?
We start the book. He is in Washington State, and basically he has come back from his left Treadstone, and he's married. He has a child, and he's dealing with PTSD, and so his wife obviously doesn't want him around their kid. And so he wants to be a father and a member of the family, but she says, you got to get your head right. And so he has put himself in this kind of self-imposed exile out in Washington State to deal with the PTSD, to get his head back in a place where he can be a productive member of the family. And then things go wrong.
I forgot to ask you a really basic question. What was Treadstone?
Treadstone was a government black ops, government sanctioned like dark program that trained soldiers, used behavior modification to take soldiers and turn them into almost superhuman assassins. So they didn't, we've all seen the movies, right? They don't really feel anything, they just go do stuff. So Treadstone, basically in the movies, were the guys in the back that Jason Bourne were always beating up, and that's what they did. And what is interesting about all that in my research, reading about Ludlum and everything else, was that there's actually a law that says it's illegal to do that. And so, like CIA assassination, everything like that, it's technically illegal. So that's why Treadstone was invented, to circumvent that law during the Cold War era.
Well, I mean, it's a useful thing for, whether it's the task force or Sigma Force or Treadstone, to make a really good thriller, and give people latitude to do stuff. You almost have to create these secret, like, black op operations. And, it's an interesting question. Are there really any? Are they really functioning out there? Or is it just all fiction? So, nobody, I'm not asking you for answers, but...
I'm not answering on camera.
Right, well, or even off camera. But I think that it's a concept that works extremely well for these kinds of books, because, if they were just straight up, CIA guys operating like that, you couldn't do all this interesting stuff. So at least in fiction, the black ops concept truly works, whether we really have it or not. It's hard to say, but we almost had a black ops operation taking out the Iranian guy. That was maybe sanctioned black op, but it was nevertheless black op. We weren't at war with Iran. To kill this guy was the kind of thing that these various operations and various thrillers actually end up doing.
Yeah, and that's what I think they say, fact is stranger than fiction. Because a lot of times if I'm having trouble coming up with some idea, I just open the newspaper.
Every day. Seriously, I think the world we're living in is so much weirder than fiction every single day. You can read the paper and think, it can't possibly be right.
Because sometimes you'll have like many ideas for a book and you're working on something so you never can write it, but it'll be like, I'd love to write a book where Russia interferes with the United States election. And you're like, that would never happen. And you're like, you start to do research and it's like, that's impossible. And then 5 years later, it's in the news. And so, literally...
And happening again.
Apparently. Who knows? Try not to watch the news anymore. Too many ideas. I gotta stay focused on one book. But, that's where we were talking earlier about people like Mark and other people who, a lot of people say, well, I didn't serve in the military. I don't think I could write a book like that or whatever. But those people, especially, they don't have the boundaries that someone who's been there and seen that, because that's what we're doing. We're kind of entering this world of willing suspension of disbelief. We're writing a story. And it's like when I play with my 3-year-old, like he loves Thomas the Trains now. So he'll be down there playing with a train, and there's no city, there's no dock, there's nothing. But in his mind, it's all there. And as we grow older, we kind of forget how to imagine and play. And I think a lot of the best storytellers in these genres and a lot of genres are the people that don't have any limits. They're like, well, why not? Why can't it exist? Can you prove to me it doesn't? And they're like, well, no. So that's what makes a great story, I think.
Absolutely right. You only have to look at Tolkien or, A. Milne in the 100-Acre Woods and Winnie the Pooh and so forth to see that. That's true. I was absolutely convinced when I was young, because my very favorite series were the Oz books, that I just had to get a little bit bigger and get some cool red shoes. And then, I could go right over the Deadly Desert and, hang out with all of them. It was a horrible blow to me the day I realized that was never going to happen. And it was really fiction.
And you know, that kind of a story like that is what got me into writing. Like when I was young, I think it was 8 or 9. I was at my grandmother's house, and this is back when they had like the VHS you would put in, and so we had rented like a James Bond movie, and I was watching it, and I think it was Thunderball, but it was over, and I was like, well, I want to, you know, see the next one, and it was like 9 o'clock, and grandmother wasn't going out to the video Rent-A-Flix to pick up another one, so she's like, well, you know, let's watch that one again. I was like, well, I don't want to watch this one again. I want to see what happens next. She's like, well, that's not going to happen. I was like, okay. Well, she had this old word processor, and so I just figured, hey, I'll just go write what happens next, you know? And so I sat down literally at this word processor, and like I've still got the story. It's terrible. But like that's kind of what got me into that is the same thing you were talking about. Is like when we learn that these things aren't true, it like kills part of us. But kids are able to just be like, okay, you're not going to rent me a movie, I'll just go write it. No big deal. How hard can it be? And I think that's like the essence of the storytelling.
I'm not at all sure. Have you gone to Comic-Con or any of these, you know, like cosplay things or whatever? Is that sort of the feeling that you get when you go there? I've often thought it must be like being a kid again, you know, and there you are being Darth Vader or, you know, Princess Leia or, you know, what are the kids all doing at the moment? It's all Frozen. You know, I saw a picture the other day of 3 little girls and they're all in costumes from Frozen and they're all, you know, and you can see that, you know, for them, it's, you know, they're playing in that world and it's all fine with them. But I sometimes think grown-ups are still doing that too. I haven't ever been to Comic-Con, but the photos I've seen of it and so forth lead me to believe that that may be what we're seeing.
I agree.
Why not? You know, I mean, it seems great to me.
Yeah.
So anything else you want to tell us about the book? We can't talk about it much without creating spoilers, but...
I don't know. Anything else you want to talk about the book?
Any of you have questions that you would like to ask about the book? We've set it up. We know why he's in Venezuela and all the rest, but what do we do? Yes.
Yeah, a couple questions if I can. So, so I learned about your work on the Real Book Spot, Ryan Steck, and on Twitter, and I saw I read the interview that you did with him that was posted this morning. So two-part question. One, could you tell us a little bit more about your protagonist? It sounded like from the interview that maybe your protagonist is a little bit more like the Jason Bourne that's in the movies rather than the Jason Bourne that's in the books. So I wanted to ask you about that. Maybe I got that wrong.
Why don't you stop there and let him answer
I'll
that
stop
one,
there.
because it's going to get too complicated, and then you can do the next one.
So your question is he more like the Jason Bourne
In the movie.
in the movie than in the book?
Yeah. Did I get that wrong from the interview?
No, he is more what I would consider kinetic in that the movies were faster than the book. Like, if you've read the original Ludlum, he does a lot of things with pacing and there's action in it, but what I kind of do, and I wouldn't say, what I guess I'm known for is I kind of write a book that I call All Killer, No Filler. Like, I just start blowing stuff up and shooting everybody. Like, when I run out of, there's
that should be right on the jacket.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously. All killer, no.
Well, it's on my website.
Those are words to live by. Lord.
Well, it's on my website, but seriously, somebody, I can't remember who it was, said, when you run out of things, when the plot starts to drag, just have somebody show up with a gun.
That's like the old PI novel when you ran out of things, she had a blonde walk in,
Yeah.
or a gun.
And so, like, I've learned you don't have to be a really good writer if you're able to, like, blow up a lot of stuff and, just start destroying things. And so it is more kinetic because I believe that, like the movie, that's kind of these books I like to read and books I like to write are something that you can just sit down and you don't want to put it, down. It's like Elmore Leonard said, just skip the boring parts. Skip the parts people
He said, I skip the words that, no, he said, I leave out the words that readers skip.
Yeah, and sometimes it gets you in trouble because they're like, "What's the guy's backstory?" Like the first book I ever wrote, Clear by Fire, they're like, "What's this guy's backstory?" And I was like, "What does it matter? Like he's just gonna kill people and then he's gonna get killed. Why do I need to have a backstory?" And they're like, "Well, it matters because this guy's the main character." And I was like, "Oh, sorry." And but that that's where I think he was saying it's more like the movie than the book. It's a very fast read, and that's what they kind of wanted was.
I totally commend your action scenes. I mean, it really is. This is a blistering pace book, and it just rockets along with the action scenes. I really enjoyed them. What was your
other question? Was in the interview there was a big announcement that you and Ryan Steck are working together on a project. Is that something that you could talk about?
Yeah, we had. It started before Treadstone, and we were working on a little book, and I'll let him tell more about it. But it's definitely a big step away from Treadstone. It's a very interesting, different, home-based type book. But yeah, I'll let
a co-authoring.
Yeah, right? Co-authoring thing, and I'll let. He's probably the best to be able to answer those questions about that one.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Anyone else? Come on, guys.
What other authors did you read when you were a kid besides the Ludlum books?
I was actually telling the story to a couple people when I walked in. My dad was a graphic artist back in the day where they literally did all the stuff by hand, and he would take it to this printing place and they would actually print it out, but they used a lot of ether, and so my dad wouldn't let me. He knew that probably my mom would get mad if I came home high off ether. So he'd send me downstairs was this used bookstore, and he'd give me like $5 and basically let me buy whatever I wanted. And then obviously he would check it afterwards. But he started me off, like the first book he ever read to me was The Hobbit. And then from there, he introduced me to 8 or 9 or 10. I was reading some Tom Clancy, and he would just let me read stuff. So literally I grew up reading a lot of the guys up here, like Clive Cussler, obviously, Dale Brown. He was big when Clancy was around. Jack Higgins. I actually wrote Jack Higgins a letter when I was 13, and he actually wrote me back, told him I wanted to be a writer, and he said go for it. So I've always tried to be, like my dad would always say, hey, if you read a thriller, you have to read a nonfiction book. And so he would always pick those. So I remember one time I read, I think, Fly the Old Dog, which was a Dale Brown book. And I was like, this is awesome. And I knew I had to read, a nonfiction book next. And so I'm like, man, I hope he doesn't get another long one. And so he brings me the freaking History of Winston Churchill. It's a
6 volumes?
Well, he brought me the first volume, and I was just like, man, are you serious? And so I'm reading through this book, and it's like the longest book, and I didn't know there was 6 volumes, or however many volumes there were. And so I finished it, and I'm like, oh, cool. So then I got to read another book, and then here comes volume number 2, and I'm like, Dad, I've already read this book. He's like, oh, this is the second part. I was like, how many books, how old is this guy? And so that was the little games he used to play to make sure that I was broadening my horizon.
Did you have nightmares? I mean, as a child at 8 and 9 reading, thrillers, and how did you stay?
I mean, that's what's kind of strange. I can only speak from my experience, but I've always kind of, like my dad, mom, and normal people say, hey, this isn't real. And like when I read it, I was like, hey, this isn't real. Like when I watched TV, I knew it wasn't real. And so I don't ever recall having nightmares, but it was just like, it's a book. It's a story. Like reading the book that I read to my son, Where the Wild Things Are.
It's actually a banned book.
Really?
Seriously?
Where the Wild Things Are has been on the banned book list I don't know how many times. Yeah, it's amazing.
Why?
It's a really good question. I'm not sure. You, once again, can Google it. But it has been, because we do a display every year during Banned Book Week, and that's one that always surprises everybody is when we haul out the Sendak, and there it is, you know. I don't know whether they think it's too scary. There's a number of odd things, but like you, I mean, I was allowed to roam free from a very, very young age, and I always understood that it was fiction. So I think in many ways, if children are barred from doing things, they take on more weight than if they just get to do them, you know, read them.
So would you let your child at 8 or 9 read?
Read my books?
Yeah.
No.
Why, you don't want to be embarrassed?
No, when I first wrote my first 2 books, I was fresh out of the military, so I used. I learned later that I'd apparently used more profanity in one of my books than, like, there was a running tally on Facebook, and like it's one of the probably the only award I've ever won. But apparently, I used the F-bomb most times in a book published by a Big 5 publisher, which was embarrassing. But I didn't know that at the time. I know that I'd used quite a bit, but it didn't really hit home until I go to church and my pastor's like, "Hey, your mom just gave me your book warning order," and I was like, "What? Why would you do that?" He's like, "No, it's a great book. I understand that that's the way that soldiers talk, but I realized that maybe I'd gone a little bit too overboard because I didn't realize that I was writing it, but I kind of felt that maybe that reflected negatively on me. Like, if you're a writer and you have to use this word like 700 times, like, maybe you're not a very good writer." So
It does argue a certain lack of imagination.
I mean, it was...
Yeah, but soldiers.
Yeah, I just told the editor I had Tourette's, and I didn't know that I was saying it. I'm sorry. But now I'm like cognizant of it, and so I wouldn't want him to read that book particularly, but it did make me realize that, like, these books are going to be there forever, and the things that you say are going to be there forever, and you need to work harder to, like, hey, you know, maybe 400 F-bombs is okay. And then
Yeah, but you're really talking just about the language, and you're not really talking about, you know, the concept of the book or whether it's a scary, you know, universe for a child to be reading. That's a different question than whether you should have edited out some of the profanity.
Well, not to get too far off topic, but I mean, that's one thing as a writer that I kind of struggle with, you know, is that I write books about killing people a lot, and that's what the genre's about and everything like that, and they're bad people and stuff, but it's kind of like a moral quandary that I never thought about until I started writing Treadstone. It's like...
Thrillers are actually about winning.
Exactly.
You have a protagonist and an antagonist, and on the way towards whichever of those is going to win the particular contest that you're on, bad things happen, and sometimes people get killed, or money gets stolen, or children get stolen. There's a lot of bad things that can happen, but ultimately a thriller is really, it's a contest between two characters, neither of whom can be good, both of whom can be good, or one can be bad and one can be good. It all depends on how you set up the book.
And
There's
that's
a lot
the
of
challenge.
moral relativism in a thriller.
And that's the challenge, is the deeper you learn about the craft and the more that you read and the more that you see how other people are telling stories, you realize that, like, what is, or what you thought was a straight and narrow, these are the rules, this is how you get to A to B, you're only limited really by the rules that you put on yourself, because people are saying, well, what about this, what about that, like the idea of the anti-hero. At one time, that wasn't a thing, and then now it's kind of mainstream, and maybe one day it'll go back to you have the white hats versus the black hats, whatever. But that's what's so interesting for me about being an author, is it's perfect for someone with ADD, because, you know, I'm just like, oh, this is boring, I'll go write a book about Venezuela, and then I'll go do this and I'll go do that, and so there's so much you can learn and always something to aim for.
So if you have ADD, how come you were a really good sniper? I'm having trouble envisioning a sniper having ADD. It doesn't seem possible.
Well, I never said I was good at it.
I just thought you'd need to stay on mission, but there we are.
There is hyper focus when you're ADD.
Oh, okay. All right. Yes.
Research. How did you approach research for the Treadstone book, and was that research different than for your first two books, your own book?
The biggest research for Treadstone that I did the most of was trying to understand kind of where Robert Ludlum came up with the idea of Bourne, and like Robert Ludlum's kind of a unique person. There's not a whole lot out there about like we just showed up and started writing books, but he talks about kind of where his headspace was at, because basically at the time we had the Cold War going on. This was written, the first Bourne was written in 1980, and so to make the correlation between the Cold War and the War on Terror was pretty easy, but I was curious about like where did this idea come from, like behavior modification of a human being, and then so I started reading, and he talked about a CIA program called, I think it was MC Ultra or Mick Ultra, where the CIA had just started dosing people with acid, like to see what would happen, and it was kind of funny but kind of sad because like these CIA dudes, like they'd be hanging out in the cafeteria and like they'd each be like dosing each other's coffee with acid. And they'd be like, "Watch Bob, I just gave him like 200 milligrams of acid," and they'd be acting all weird. But they wanted to see like it's true, you can look it up, and so I think they were trying to figure out, because they thought the Russians could do it, to break somebody's mind and to get them to do what they wanted. And so you start reading about that, and it's pretty fascinating, and then you're like, well, how did he know about that? Like, this wasn't really open source back then. And so it was just, I did a lot of research. The main research I did besides that was on Venezuela, because there's not a whole lot of information out there, and honestly, I couldn't have picked the worst place, because it was like, I need a train that goes from here to here. I'm sure that they have it. They don't. Or, I need an airport over here. I'm sure they have it. Nope. And I was like, man, why didn't I pick, like, I don't know, Colombia or someplace else? But I think it all worked out.
You did too. So I have a question. Did you sign a one-book contract, or did you sign up, because oftentimes the state contracts are just single books. Are you contracted to write another one? Or you don't know yet?
No, I'm working on the second one now. They did sign me to the first one, and then I didn't screw that up very bad, so they asked me. I didn't know that they did that. They only signed one at a time, so I was like, now what? And I was like, do I start another one? And they're like, no, not yet. I was like, oh man, I must have really messed this up. But then I heard that everybody really enjoyed the book, and they're like, hurry up with the second.
No, that's pretty much standard operating procedure for estate contracts. One book, sometimes two.
That would have been totally embarrassing if I only got one then.
Not necessarily. Look at all the people who've switched around with Clancy. Mark wrote them. Right now we've got Mike Madden and Mark Cameron writing them, and there were, I think, at least two others or so forth. So, there can be a fair amount of turnover. Partly it's because people very often are writing books of their own, and they want to go back to that, or whatever. But basically the publisher's not in charge, the estate's in charge. And so, Tom is like the guru of these, but ultimately the Ludlum estate, gets to say, we'd rather continue, or we'd rather have somebody else, or whatever. So, it's a contract. So I wouldn't take any of it personally.
Would still like to write more than one.
Well, we'd encourage you to write more than one.
Yes.
No, I think it would be wonderful. Does anybody have a final question? Yes, sir.
When you're writing this book compared to your own books, did you feel any pressure because of the Bourne legacy, of how many people love Ludlum's books and the movies? So was there a lot of pressure that you put on yourself, or did you feel anything like that?
The best way I can describe it, and have described it, it was like Robert Ludlum gave me the keys to his Bentley. And I've never ridden in a Bentley. I've seen a few, but he's like, "Hey, drive my Bentley around." And you don't want to be the guy who brings the Bentley back dinged up. And, so my thought going into it was, I want to bring the Bentley back. I want to have a full tank of gas. I want to, make sure everything's shined up and it looks good. And that's good thinking when you start doing it. You're like, I'm going to do this. And then you, get halfway through and it's like you're a minor league pitcher that just got called up for the Yankees. And they're like, hey, you're going to pitch game 1 of the World Series. And so I learned really quickly that actually it was John Gilstrap who told me a long time ago. He said, you got to dance with the one who brought you. And probably doesn't remember he said this, but I had the email. What he meant was, what I took from it was, if you're good enough to get a book publisher to get somewhere, there's something that you brought there that's good enough, and they saw your skill. And so you gotta stick with that. And once you start, I believe that what people call about writer's block and pressure is you start to get into your own head and you start to say, what about this? What about that? And you're basically not dancing with the one who brought you. You're trying to think, what would she like me to write about? Or what would Tom like me to write about? Or what would the LUDLUM'S like to write about? And so I had to go back to that basic premise because, yes, I felt a whole lot of pressure. All of a sudden it was just man, I've been staring at this same screen for 8 hours a day for 3 or 4 days. And, my wife's I would set a word count every day and she'd be like, did you make your word count? And I said, no. You haven't made your word count a lot. What's wrong? And I was like, well, maybe they've got to be good words. I can make a word count all day long. I can sit there and put X amount of words on a page, but they have to be good words. And so it wasn't until I realized, you got here because, you worked hard to get here, and you're basically self-sabotaging yourself. Just do what you do. And that's kind of when the pressure went away, basically, because it's hey, you're going to turn in 400 blank pages. That's not going to work.
It's not going to work super well. So I think we should sign off with that wonderful slogan of yours. Tell me again what it is.
All killer, no filler.
All killer, no filler. We're solidified for sure. Let's give Josh a round of applause and thank you.